Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Ill Factor from beatacademy.com. And in this video, I'm going to be breaking down Silk Sonic's Smoking Out the Window and sharing some music production tips and techniques along the way. So let me show you the finished product. So this one was a tough one because what we're obviously trying to replicate is the feel and the authenticity of real musicians in the studio showing off their gifted talents in coming up with such an amazing end result. So what's the purpose of this video? Is the purpose to just dial in the presets and to go exactly and find the right sounds that are to be used in a song like this? Well, I think the goal of what I would love for you to take away from this video is not necessarily what sounds to use, but the nuances that go into crafting and creating an authentic type of feel and vibe in your type of productions. Whether you're going to be producing something similar to this genre of music or just any type of music, there are the small details that go a long, long way. So throughout this video, we're going to be talking about creating that type of nuance and vibe with the drums, the bass, and all the other instruments. So be sure to watch to the end because all the small details that are covered in this video make a big difference. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the drums. All right, let's start a little bit about the mindset of sound selection. I mean, that's 80% of the heavy lifting right there, is locating and finding the right sounds to begin with, using the right drum kits, using the right type of sounds. I might not be 100% spot on, but getting in the ballpark is really important. So if I was using a heavy metal drum kit, it just wouldn't match well, or just a typical rock drum kit, an acoustic drum kit. I need something specifically that is focused around the time and era and the vibe that you would normally find in 70s, R&B, and soul, which is what Silk Sonic is trying to focus in on. So you can do a little research, find out the drum kits. And for this, I'm using Excellent Audio's Addictive Live Drum Kit. So we're going with Addictive Drums 2. This is a live acoustic drum kit. And I tried the vintage drum kit and just didn't like the results that I was getting from vintage because obviously my mind went vintage. But then I went to the modern soul and R&B drum kit and just thought all the kits and the tone and the timbre of the drums fit and sounded better for this particular song. So I'm using the Got Soul preset. We can head over here to the kit and I'm adding a couple different instrumentation. So I'm adding this tambourine, this rhythm deck here, because we're going to use that later on, as you'll see when we start working on our programming. But pretty much left everything the way it is with just toning down the overhead and the room. This is a little bit more dry, so there isn't a lot of the room ambience that was captured in the recording here. This is nice, dry, and a little bit in your face, so that's what we're going for. So when you want drier drums from your live acoustic drum kit, focus on moving the room mic lower in the mix, or just dropping the room mic and any of the ambience lower. All right, so let's look at the programming because this is what really helps getting your drums to feel more humanistic and organic. Here is our kick and snare pattern. Now you'll notice there's different shades already with my kick drum. And so I want to make sure that my timing is not spot on, right? I'm not trying to step sequence and robot. So if you are drawing in your notes with your drums, you want to be sure that when you double click, whether you're in Fruity Loops or in Logic or here in ABleton Live, you want to be sure to get off the grid, not all the time, but you don't want to have everything perfectly snapping on the grid. The grid meaning the timing of this MIDI performance. So if I just nudge this over just slightly, you can hold your command button so that you can nudge away from the grid. This is going to add more of that humanistic feel to it. So we have, as you can see, some of the kick drums ahead, some a little bit behind. This also helps if you're playing if you're freehand recording. So if you're not step sequencing or you're not drawing your notes and you're playing this by hand, that's also cool. And then I want to quantize not by 100%, but just make sure that my quantize settings are set lower, maybe in the 48 or 50 ballpark, 50%. That way it's not snapping directly onto the nearest grid marker. All right, so we've got our kick and snare pattern. Let's add our hi-hat pattern, okay? So for this, let's start with an open hi-hat, and then we'll close it by creating our closed hi-hat here. So okay. So in theory, this should be the correct pattern. So we'll just play this. All right, and we'll just duplicate this all the way through for this pattern right here. Now, in theory, that's it. That's the right rhythmic timing. But when you picture a real drummer, when I hire real drummers in my sessions, there's that tick-tack, right? That ghost notes that go a long way to make this feel more authentic. So if I just drew in a second note for that hi-hat, it's adding that extra beat that doesn't feel authentic. So what we need to do is create this as a ghost note. We can do that by lowering the velocity. So let's just lower that down. And we got something like this. See? As opposed to ta-ta-ta. We want the first note to be accented, and we want the second one to be less on the velocity. And that's more of an authentic, that's more of something, a nuance that you would see a real drummer do when they're playing the drum kit. All right, so now that we have that there, let's go ahead and duplicate that, and maybe just bring the second one up slightly, duplicate that again, and bring this one down a little bit more, just creating some differences even throughout all of my changes there. So all right, so you notice the difference already. So let's go ahead and just do that all across. And then we'll need a open hi-hat back here. And take these out over here. Now I want to saturate these drums. So I'm going to use my overdrive plugin here from ABleton Live, just giving a little bit of drive here. And just bringing the tone up because that's going to brighten up the overall sound. And I'm playing around with my dry and wet till I get a nice balance. If it's too much, it helps just brighten it up, and that saturation, believe it or not, saturation is just a great tool to glue your drums together. Now I want to reinforce that kick drum. I'm going to add a separate kick drum and copy the kick drum pattern, but use a kick drum sample that I might have, maybe just a short 808 that can just help create some nice beef for the bottom end of that kick drum. So I have a MIDI track here loaded with a simpler and loaded with a kick sample. Something nice short, we've got a nice little bottom end beef there. And let's just drag and drop by holding the Option key, this pattern, the live acoustic drum pattern, over to our kick drum pattern. Now, we don't want this many kicks playing at the same time. So all we need is this kick drum pattern. So let's just go ahead, select this, erase it. And this is going to be a couple octaves too low. So let's just hold Shift up, and C3 is the original root note of the sample. That way it plays the same pattern as our kick drum here. And we're really kind of using this as a way to beef up the low end. Now, one thing I like to do in my productions is layer my program drums, the live acoustic drums that we just created, with some drum breaks or drum loops. And what I tend to see is that it helps fill the gaps, so to speak, with some of the nuances and especially with the texture that I think might be missing with my program drums. So here's an audio track with a drum sample. So let me just go ahead and solo this. I'm going to drag this into another track. And let's go ahead and hear the full length of this loop. So I got this maybe from Slate Digital, the Aurora sound pack, and it was a really cool drum loop. I especially liked the rim knock. I think it'll add more bottom and just texture to my rim knock. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to just, as you can see here, I don't need the whole loop. What we want to do is just capture, especially this part here, the relationship between the rim knock and the hi-hats that are sometimes captured a lot better in live drum breaks and live recordings than the programmed ones. So as you can see here, I'm just creating and editing my own pattern by highlighting certain sections and just erasing them. And I do this till I find a good groove that complements my drums. So this is without it. And this is with it. And similarly, when we go into the chorus section here, one thing I also do is I'll incorporate another drum loop. So let me drag this down here, extend this out so we can see the whole length here. So all these cool little sections here. And the flams that we hear, the little rolls that we get, I love those, and I can definitely hear that in our reference. Now, one thing I like to do is I don't like to just, as you can see here, I'm not deleting these notes here because I think they'll give presence, is just section those off by, is what I'll do is I'll go ahead and split that, create a new region, but instead of deleting it, we'll double click this and lower the gain. So it's still there. I'll kind of keep it maybe in the same volume as the hi-hat. It's still there, but yet, because when I delete it, you'll notice that I tend to notice it gone. But when I leave the gain down, it's there. So it keeps the rhythm and the timing just right. So that's what I've done. I went through all these and I just went ahead and lowered the gain on some of these individual hits. That way we can maintain the rhythm, but yet still keep that snare drum or the texture of that snare drum lower, and my snare drum or rim knock will take precedence. So let's go ahead and solo this section here. This is the chorus section. So that's the edit. Let's listen to it with the drums. Cool. So now all I'm going to be doing is just using an EQ, stock EQ, to take away some of the low end and leave that for my live acoustic drum and my new kick drum. And just bring this the high mids a little lower so that it's not sticking out or getting in the way, and just try to make it feel as organic as possible. And then we're going to add some percussion elements such as a shaker here. I'm going to go with an egg shaker. And I'm panning the egg shaker just slightly to the right. And adding some dimension by inserting a reverb directly onto the shaker. This is without it. So it helps just send that shaker a little further back. I'm just going to tuck that in a little bit. And then in the chorus section, I have a tambourine roll for that nice little drum breakdown section. So that's what's going on there. And with the fills, that's really just kind of vibing and listening to the reference and then following along with their fills. So that's also what you want to do, is when you're working on fills, especially with a live acoustic drum, you're also watching out for the velocities. You can see here my velocity starts out strong, but then I lower the velocity as the tom rolls go down. And so that's also going to change the feel as well. And inside the addictive drums, I'm also editing the decay and the sustain, the release, so those toms don't linger after they're being hit. Well, now I've got all the drums in place. I'm going to group them all together, and then I'm going to create a drum bus by just having them all grouped. And we're going to now treat the sonics of the drums. So I'm going to start off with a virtual mix rack here. And I was going back and forth with different type of compressors. Essentially what I'm looking for here is something that isn't going to make the kick and snare pop a little more. I wanted it all to kind of just make everything smooth and just bring everybody all together. So I'm using the Slate Digital virtual mix rack. We've got some saturation here, some analog channel saturation, and I'm using the custom opto compressor here for this. So let me go ahead, just turn everything else off. And this is more about being smooth rather than just having my kick and snare pop really in front here. I want it all to be just kind of a nice, even, dynamic performance with that. Then I'm going to use a drum bus plugin here by ABleton Live to add a little bit of drive and using the transient designer on the drum bus to give a little bit more kind of a staccato response and just shorten up the drums a little bit. And I have this at 33%, so I'm not doing a lot of that. And then next, we're having the Fab Filter Saturn plugin. And this is a multi-band saturation plugin. But I'm not splitting any of the bands. I'm just using the warm tape mode and adding some tape saturation on the whole overall drums. And then we can go ahead and add a little EQ. It's amazing just by taking some of that boxiness out right there. And just warming the drums up by killing a little bit of the high end that's already there. All right, so for the bass, 70s, I was thinking, why not just head over and use a 70s P bass? Now, I do have a bass here, and I tried a couple of times playing it, and I had the riff down, just didn't really like the tone, or it didn't come close to the tone I was looking for. So I then brought up Moto Bass here by AK Multimedia and just chose 70s P bass. So I bring the muting up, and what that's going to do is just muffle the actual sound of the strings a little bit. So it just lingers a little bit. So just muting the bass, and that was it. And then using a compressor, just a stock compressor, just to control any resonance that might cause the bass to just poke out a little bit. So I'm just doing about 2 dB of gain. Now, a big part of capturing this is also similar to what we did with the drums, is to make sure that our bass notes aren't 100% on the grid as well. You want the bass, especially the bass, to be loose, vibey, and that means you definitely have to mess around with the velocity. And so we have some pitch bending happening here, as you can see at the very end of this, the beginning of this note, to capture that nice bend from the beginning of that note. And the EQ is just going to help warm the tone of the bass by eliminating some of that high end. I'm just finding some resonance here. So let's go ahead and focus on the electric guitar parts. Now, I'm not the greatest guitar player in the world. I kind of actually suck, but I know enough to actually put my fingers on the chords and just strum it a couple times. And if you're an amateur guitar player, I'm going to share with you a method that could be really helpful when trying to get a good, decent take in your recordings. So this has to do a lot with comping. So initially here is the guitar part. You can see these different regions here. So what's happening is I'm basically comping and going over and over and finding different takes, as many takes as I just play the same chord over and over again. And then I'll go ahead and go to the next chord section, just play that same chord over and over again. And then what I'm essentially doing is just locating the right chord or the best performance, highlighting that, and basically dragging that over to the top. So I'm creating the take that I want. So here in Ableton Live, I can just highlight this and hit enter, And that's going to send that highlighted part of that take up to the main track. So I'm essentially comping my guitar parts. So that's the one strum that we hear. And so for the tone, I decided to go with Guitar Rig 5. I start off with a stop compressor, almost like a compressor pedal, and going through the lead 800, but not normally. You would normally go through this to get like some crazy distortion, but bringing the preamp all the way down, just a little bit of crunch, and then a little bit of chorus here. All right, so then I have another guitar part right here I call Chuck, and that is just kind of like accenting certain things, but with a heavy string reverb. And for that, I'm just using Guitar Rig, and I'm using the Twang reverb preset, almost like a Fender reverb, just to accent certain parts there. Now, I'm also EQing the guitar a little bit, but here's what's really cool. I'm going to grab this compressor and sidechain the guitar to the kick drum that we added. And that's going to cause some ducking. So that's also going to help my just the overall bounce and feel of the guitars. So it moves out of the way every time the kick is playing. And that's a kind of really cool way to add a little bit of groove. Not too much, but just a little bit of groove to the guitar parts there. I'm also sending some effects to these guitar parts. So I've got a reverb on B and a reverb on C. These are two different reverbs. So for my reverb on return track B, I have just kind of like a large room reverb. This is just a stock big room reverb from ABleton Live. And I'm sending a little bit of that to the drums. And then I have on return track C, a reverb plugin from IK Multimedia called Sunset Sound. And I liked the spring, the plate spring reverb. So I wanted a spring reverb, and that's what I'm running some of these sounds from here. I make sure to pan the guitar a little bit over here to the left, and then our little chucks are panned slightly to the right. And then I have on return track A, just some delay here. So this is about an 1/8 note delay. So we've got our rhythm section down. We've got our drums and our bass and the guitars. Now let's go and highlight that counter melody. And this is something that's really cool to utilize that you hear a lot in just some classic R&B soul songs, that you have this nice classic melody. And in this case, we have it here with the guitar. I added a flute and a cool glockenspiel bell. Now that little bend, I purposely added it there to show you that if you don't have a guitar or you're trying to add that in there, I basically added a pitch bend here. So I went to the clip and I chose transposition. As you can see, I'm adding a little bit of just that little bend there at the beginning of that hit. So this is me again on the guitar. So I have a Fender Tele that I'm playing here in the studio. And I'm using the same, I'm just using a Tweedman cabinet here in Guitar Rig. We're going to layer that with what I heard, and I'm not sure if it is a flute, but I definitely heard the texture of a flute. And I do like the texture this flute is giving. I'm also doing the same bend there as well. So this is Native Instruments Contact, and this is the factory library, the library that you get stocked with Contact here. And I went and went to the orchestral section, looked for flute, and that's the one I chose. Had it set to the sustain. Didn't do anything, but just loaded this preset because I just needed a flute sound. So if you're using Omnisphere or anything like that, you can find a basic flute patch and it'll do just fine. But the nuance here goes a long way. You notice those first notes. So we have two notes happening here. Now these notes are really too low to be in the register of a flute. So what are they doing? Well, these notes here are actually triggering the articulation of the flute. So here's the melody line. But what I'm using this note here to do is to switch between staccato and sustaining notes. So going back to the library here, you'll notice that sustain, it gives you the corresponding note for that articulation. So you notice how it goes to staccato, then back to sustain. If I played the notes in sustain, it just wouldn't have the same feel. So I want to make sure, as a real flute player would play, that those notes would be in staccato. Bum, 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 bum. So we have articulation that we need to change. So what I need to do is make sure that I'm triggering these notes, D sharp 0, which is the staccato articulation, and then transition over to having that note in sustain articulation. That's why you have D sharp 0 and C 0 here. If we just did C 0 all the way, you just don't have the same impact. And so then I'm layering that with the glockenspiel. This is also from Native Instruments Contact Library, Factory Library preset. And that's almost a really cool staple that you hear in a lot of throwback R&B songs. That glockenspiel adds that nice, brilliant shimmer to some of those counter melody lines. So this is everybody all together. So what we're gonna do is I had a reverb on the group, but I ended up not using that because I'm sending some of that, all the group to, or just the guitar and the flute to the spring reverb, and I separated the glockenspiel and sending it to another reverb there. Then underneath that, we're having just a Rhodes, I'm using a Rhodes here to kind of fill up the sound between these counter melodies. So this is the Addictive Keys, and it's just a Mark I stage piano preset. And I'm using a phaser plugin directly onto the Rhodes. And what this tends to do is add a lot of movement, and we're getting a modulation happening, and it gives the track the sense of movement or flutter. And that's what I was looking for. And these are great things to add to the track. I don't want the Rhodes to be in the limelight. Actually, I want it to be felt more than heard. So let's listen to the difference when we have everybody in. Now, when we move over to the chorus or pre-chorus section, we're introduced with a couple more elements in there. Now, a lot of throwback 70s soulful R&B tunes, such as the Stylistics, have this really cool sitar sound that is really noticeable in a lot of their melodies, or even sometimes the counter melodies. So I was trying to figure out what I could place on the electric guitar that would make it sound like a sitar, but then I thought, let me just use a sitar preset. So once again, I'm loading the Contact library here from Native Instruments, went over to the factory library and just looked for the sitar. Made sure to switch it to solo so that I'm not trying to play any chords here. But essentially, once we have the sound, and then I'm kind of creating a nice image here with the chorus. So I'm using Ableton Live's chorus plugin. And that's gonna widen that up a little bit as well. Then we're introduced with some strings. And so I'm using all the factory library sounds in Native Instrument Contact library here. So for this, I wanna make sure I'm going with a string ensemble and not a whole string section. The ensemble is gonna give me a little bit less voicing, and that's particularly noticeable when you've got a lot of throwback songs like the reference that we're using. So we've got the notes here, and I'm using a flanger to cause some more modulation. All these little effects, like the flanger and the chorus, they help create the depth. Without them, tracks kind of feel very stale and not wide. So all these little details here. So I'm having a flanger directly on there, lowering the rate of the time. Same thing here. So with the strings, velocity is going to go a long way. So making sure that these build up as well. So I'll start here and going a little stronger in the last note. All right, and then we have the glockenspiel walking up with those as well, same patch. Let's hear what that sounds like. Now let's go ahead and talk about the horns. I have to say, horns are probably the hardest thing to replicate because it's just hard. There's so many. There are some really good VST horn patches that do a great job in the sampling. Unfortunately, I wanted to just use kind of stock horns, but here's what I ended up doing. I ended up loading the arcade plugin by Output and kind of browsing through their 70s patch, going over and looking for some horn riffs. And so what I did was, once I found a cool preset and a patch that had a couple of horn loops and samples, I tend to just go ahead and play a bunch of them and record them into an audio track. So that's what we see here. This is me just playing a bunch of as opposed to finding a horn patch and playing them on the keyboard. So what I'm doing is making sure I'm finding the articulation that I need. And that's what we have here. I have a quick little stab. Let me go ahead and lower the... And then what I did was just find the right note. And I pitched up or down the notes that I need to have that belong. So then I duplicated that and then just pitched it a whole octave higher. But you see, the moment I did that, it just came off weird. So I need to make sure I'm changing it from Beats to Complex or Complex Pro. So I like Complex Pro, and we'll put these two together. So it has a little bit of that texture of the high-pitched one. And I need to probably take that note off right there. And now let's see what it sounds like. So I've got that bam, right? So I might want to have bam, bam. So I'll just take this right here, duplicate that, and then pitch this down to right there. But now we're also, sometimes the problem with this is you have notes in a chord that don't belong there, right? So I need to, once again, find maybe a singular note that I have here. So that might work better. I'll just grab that note, drag that over. And pitch this one up. And there you go. So now we have that. And that's going to be better. So I can hold Shift down now that these are warped and actually stretch this, so I can actually stretch the timing of this and get this right there. So I'm going to just Shift, holding Shift and dragging that out will extend the timing. There you go. So now we have. So what I hope you're walking away with from this video is the details that go into creating the authentic vibe that you might be looking for in your projects, adjusting the velocity, adjusting the overall timing of the notes that you're drawing in or performing, and also sound selection, focusing on trying to create the depth and space by adding the modulation such as chorus, flanger, and those type of effects. But a little bit goes a long way. That's what we have to make sure and to keep note of when you're trying to create something in this vein, or anything in that matter in your projects. Well, thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful, encouraging, and inspiring in any way, shape, or form. And as my gift to you for watching this video, I'd love to send you a sample pack filled with loops and sounds that you can use in your projects absolutely free, and they're 100% royalty free, so you can feel free to use them in any projects that you're currently working on. And if you're looking for professional guidance in helping you take that next step with your music production, then I would encourage you to visit beatacademy.com and take advantage of all the resources I have available for you there, as well as the mentorship opportunities to help you grow in producing the music that you are trying to create. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and like this video so you can stay up to date with upcoming new videos. And comment below which was your favorite part of this video and what would you like to see in upcoming videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.